Studio B had witnessed countless, legendary recordings since opening in 1956. Frank Sinatra had crooned here. Nat King Cole had made magic here. The Beach Boys had captured lightning in a bottle within these walls. But nothing that had happened in those 36 years could prepare anyone for what was about to unfold during the recording of I Will Always Love You. David Foster sat in the control room surrounded by the finest recording equipment money could buy, checking his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. It was 6 p.m., and they were supposed to be done by 7. Simple math. One song, one artist, 1 hour. Whitney Houston's voice could do anything, and I Will Always Love You was a straightforward ballad that required emotional honesty more than technical gymnastics. Dolly Parton had written it as a gentle country goodbye. David's arrangement had transformed it into an epic love anthem. All Whitney had to do was sing it. 1 take, maybe 2 if they wanted options. They'd be home by 8. 6 hours later, at midnight, they were on take 43, and nobody was going home. Whitney stood in the vocal booth wearing the same black turtleneck and jeans she'd arrived in 6 hours earlier. Her hair, which had been perfectly styled at 6 p.m., now hung in damp strands around her face. The climate control in Capitol Studios was excellent, but no air conditioning system could compensate for the heat generated by mounting anxiety and exhaustion. She held the lyric sheet in trembling hands even though she'd memorized every word weeks ago. Behind the glass, David Foster's expression had shifted from confident to concerned to something approaching desperation. The legendary producer who had worked with Barbra Streisand, Celine Dion, and Michael Bublé had never experienced a session like this. Every take Whitney delivered was technically impeccable. Perfect pitch, perfect timing, perfect breath control. But something essential was missing, and that something was the only thing that mattered. Tommy Vicari, the recording engineer, had stopped making notes after take 30. He glanced at his assistant Michael, with an expression that communicated what neither of them wanted to say aloud. This wasn't working, and they had no idea how to fix it. Whitney. David's voice came through the talkback, measured and encouraging despite his internal panic. That was beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. But I need more vulnerability. I need to hear your heart breaking. Through the glass, they watched Whitney nod and adjust her headphones. She took a long breath, closed her eyes, and prepared to sing the same song she'd already sung 43 times that evening. The instrumental track started again, and Whitney began the 44th take with the same technical perfection that had characterized all the others. Her voice soared through Dolly Parton's melody with ease that would make any vocal coach weep with pride. Every note perfectly placed, every phrase perfectly shaped, every moment perfectly controlled. It was brilliant. It was flawless. It was completely wrong. David stopped the take after the first chorus. Whitney, can you come out here for a minute? When Whitney entered the control room, she could see the frustration on David's face despite his attempt to hide it. More concerning, she could see the same frustration reflected in the eyes of every person in the room. They all knew this wasn't working, but nobody knew how to articulate what was wrong or how to fix it. I don't understand, Whitney said quietly. I'm hitting every note. I'm following the arrangement. What am I doing wrong? David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture everyone who worked with him recognized as a sign of deep stress. You're not doing anything wrong, Whitney. That's the problem. You're being too perfect. This song isn't about technical perfection. It's about heartbreak. It's about loving someone so much that you have to let them go. I need to hear that pain in your voice. Whitney's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. I am feeling it, David. I'm giving you everything I have. No, David said, more sharply than he intended. You're giving me your technique. I need your soul. The tension in the room became palpable. Session musicians who had been there since 6 p.m. were exchanging glances and checking their watches. Union regulations required breaks every few hours, and they were well past due. But nobody wanted to be the one to suggest stopping, because that would feel like admitting defeat. Let's take 5, David finally said. Everyone grab some coffee, use the bathroom, clear your heads. We'll come back fresh. But Whitney didn't move. She stood in the control room staring at the lyric sheet as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Her vocal coach, Gary Katona, had been sitting quietly in the corner observing. Now he approached Whitney with concern evident on his face. Your voice is getting tired, he said gently. I can hear it in the upper register. You're compensating with technique, but you need to rest. Whitney shook her head. We're not leaving until this is done. David needs this song for the movie, and I'm not going to be the reason the Bodyguard soundtrack fails. The Bodyguard. The movie that was supposed to prove Whitney Houston could be both a music icon and a legitimate actress. The movie that Kevin Costner had believed in enough to make her his co-star despite Hollywood's skepticism. The movie that carried not just her career ambitions, but her dreams of being taken seriously beyond the recording studio. The pressure of all that expectation was sitting on Whitney's shoulders like a physical weight. And with each failed take, that weight grew heavier. By take 60, Whitney's voice was showing signs of serious fatigue. The upper notes that had come easily at 6 p.m. now required visible effort. Her breath control, normally superhuman, was becoming erratic. Gary pulled David aside and spoke in a low voice that Whitney couldn't hear but could definitely sense. She needs to stop. If she keeps pushing like this, she could damage her vocal cords. We should reschedule for tomorrow when she's rested. David's response was immediate and unequivocal. There is no tomorrow. Kevin is waiting for this track. The movie's release date is locked. We finish tonight. David, I'm serious. Her voice. I know her voice better than you think, David interrupted. And I know what she's capable of. She's not at her limit yet. She's just in her head. But Gary wasn't wrong about the physical toll. Whitney's throat was raw from hours of sustained singing. Her head was pounding from dehydration and stress. Her hands shook when she picked up her water bottle, and when she looked at herself in the control room glass, she barely recognized the exhausted woman staring back. Take 65. Take 68. Take 71. Each one technically proficient and emotionally hollow. With every attempt, Whitney could feel herself falling deeper into a hole she didn't know how to climb out of. The more she tried to access the emotion David wanted, the more mechanical her performance became. It was as if her body was protecting her from going to the vulnerable place the song demanded. At take 73, something inside Whitney finally broke. Whitney was halfway through the second verse when her voice suddenly cracked on a note she'd hit perfectly 72 times before. But this wasn't a technical crack, an error in placement or breath support. This was her voice giving up, surrendering, refusing to maintain the facade of perfection any longer. She stopped singing and pressed her hand against the microphone stand to steady herself. Through the glass, David and the entire control room watched as Whitney Houston, one of the greatest vocalists in music history, slid down the wall of the vocal booth and sat on the floor with her head in her hands. I can't, they heard through the microphone. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I can't do this anymore. My voice is gone. David's finger hovered over the talkback button, but he didn't press it. Something in his expression had changed. He was seeing something the rest of the room couldn't see yet. A transformation happening in real time. Tommy Vicari leaned forward. David, she's done. We need to let her rest and come back tomorrow. But David shook his head slowly. Roll tape. What? David, she just said she can't. Roll the fucking tape. Tommy exchanged a glance with Michael, then shrugged and pressed record. Take 74 was officially in progress, even though Whitney was still sitting on the floor of the vocal booth with her face in her hands, seemingly unaware that anyone was still listening. For a long moment, the only sound in Studio B was Whitney's ragged breathing through the microphone. Then, so quietly that the engineers had to adjust the levels to pick it up, she began to speak. Not sing, speak. The opening lyrics of I Will Always Love You as broken confession rather than polished performance. If I should stay, I would only be in your way. The words came out raw and unguarded, her voice cracking not from technical failure but from genuine emotion finally finding its way to the surface. She was talking to someone specific now, not performing for a movie soundtrack. She was talking to Bobby Brown, the man she loved who was slowly destroying himself and pulling her down with him. She was talking to the parts of herself she was losing to fame and expectation and the constant pressure to be perfect. She was talking to the girl she used to be before the world decided who Whitney Houston should become. In the control room, David Foster felt his breath catch. This was it. This was what he'd been searching for through 73 perfect takes. Not technical brilliance, but human truth. He pressed the talkback button, his voice barely above a whisper so as not to break the spell. Whitney. Sing it like that. Exactly like that. Whitney looked up at the control room glass, her eyes red and her face streaked with tears. David, I can't. My voice, your voice is perfect. Stop thinking. Stop trying. Just feel it and let it out. Whitney pulled herself up from the floor using the microphone stand for support. She didn't adjust her hair or wipe her tears or do any of the things she normally did to prepare for a take. She just stood there, exhausted and vulnerable and completely exposed, and waited for the instrumental track to start. When it did, something miraculous happened. Whitney began to sing, "I Will Always Love You," with a voice that was technically imperfect in every way. The upper notes wobbled slightly because her vocal cords were fatigued. Her vibrato was wider and less controlled than usual. Her breath support was inconsistent, forcing her to snatch breaths in places that weren't musically ideal. Every rule of proper vocal technique was being broken or bent. And it was the most beautiful thing anyone in that studio had ever heard. Because for the first time in 74 takes, Whitney Houston wasn't performing. She was confessing. She was bleeding. She was letting everyone hear exactly how much it hurt to love someone you couldn't save. To be someone you weren't sure you wanted to be. To carry the weight of everyone's expectations while feeling like you were drowning. The musicians in the control room had stopped moving. Tommy's hand hovered over the mixing board, frozen in place. Gary Katona, the vocal coach who had tried to get Whitney to stop, had tears streaming down his face. And David Foster, the legendary perfectionist who had demanded 74 takes in search of something he couldn't articulate, was gripping the edge of the console so hard his knuckles were white. When Whitney reached the key change in the final chorus, her voice did something that defied explanation. Despite being exhausted, despite being technically compromised, despite having every reason to crack and fail, her voice soared. Not with the controlled power of the previous takes, but with the raw, desperate power of someone giving absolutely everything they had left. The final note hung in the air for what felt like forever. Whitney holding it not through technique, but through sheer force of will. And when it finally faded into silence, she collapsed against the microphone stand and whispered, "I have nothing left." For several seconds, nobody in the control room moved or spoke. The tape continued rolling, capturing only the sound of Whitney's exhausted breathing and the stunned silence of everyone who had just witnessed something transcendent. Then David Foster pressed the talkback button and said two words that would change music history. "That's it." Whitney looked up, confused. "What? That's the take. That's the one that goes on the record." Tommy Vicari found his voice. "David, there are technical issues. The pitch on the bridge is slightly sharp, the vibrato is inconsistent. There's a breath noise at 2 minutes 13. David cut him off. "I don't care. That's the take. Don't touch it, don't fix it, don't auto-tune anything." Whitney's voice on take 75 is what the world is going to hear. Whitney stumbled out of the vocal booth and into the control room. "Play it back," she said. "I need to hear it." Tommy rewound the 2-inch tape and pressed play. As Whitney's voice filled the control room speakers, singing "I Will Always Love You," with all its technical imperfections and emotional nakedness, something extraordinary happened. Every person in that room understood simultaneously that they weren't listening to a pop song anymore. They were listening to a piece of someone's soul that had been captured on tape. Whitney stood in the center of the control room with her arms wrapped around herself, listening to her own voice as if it belonged to a stranger. When the playback ended, she turned to David with an expression of confusion and wonder. "Is that really what I sound like?" David nodded. "That's what you sound like when you stop hiding. That's what you sound like when you let us see the real Whitney instead of the perfect one." Gary Katona, who had spent years helping Whitney develop her technical skills, spoke up. "That's the most vulnerable I've ever heard you. It's like you forgot we were listening and just sang for yourself." Whitney sank into a chair, the adrenaline that had carried her through 75 takes finally draining away. "I thought I was failing. I thought my voice was giving up." "Your voice wasn't giving up," David said gently. "Your defenses were giving up. All the armor you've built to protect yourself from judgment, from criticism, from failure. That armor finally cracked, and that's when we heard the truth." Michael, the assistant engineer who had been mostly silent all evening, finally spoke. "That's going to be the biggest song in the world." He said it with such certainty that everyone in the room turned to look at him. "I'm serious. I've been in this industry 10 years, and I've never heard anything that will connect with people the way that performance will. It's not perfect, but that's exactly why it's perfect." The clock on the studio wall showed 3:47 a.m. They had been in Studio B for nearly 10 hours. Whitney's voice was shattered. Her confidence had been dismantled and rebuilt, and she had given the performance of her lifetime using a voice that was technically compromised in every measurable way. David Foster made a decision that night that went against every instinct he developed in his career. He told Tommy not to do any pitch correction, not to smooth out the vibrato, not to remove the breath noises or fix the slight timing inconsistencies. Take 75 would go on the Bodyguard soundtrack, exactly as Whitney had sung it at 3:47 a.m. with a broken voice and a broken heart. The record company executives heard the final mix 2 weeks later and immediately expressed concerns. The pitch was inconsistent. The vibrato was too wide. There were audible imperfections that could easily be fixed with available technology. David's response to every concern was the same. That's the take. Those imperfections are what make it real. Kevin Costner, calling from the Bodyguard editing room, had a different reaction. After listening to Whitney's performance once, he called David back and said 6 words. That's the greatest vocal I've ever heard. When I Will Always Love You was released in November 1992. Radio programmers initially expressed reservations about the song's length and unconventional structure. But when it hit the airwaves, something unprecedented happened. Listeners called radio stations demanding to hear it again. And again. And again. The song debuted at number 1 and stayed there for 14 consecutive weeks. It became the best-selling single by a female artist in music history. It won Grammy Awards, broke sales records, and established Whitney Houston as not just a talented singer but a transcendent artist capable of making people feel emotions they didn't know they could access through a recording. But the most significant impact of that 75-take session wasn't measured in sales or awards. It was measured in the hundreds of vocalists who heard Whitney's imperfect, vulnerable performance and realized that technical perfection was less important than emotional honesty. Whitney herself carried the memory of that session for the rest of her life. In interviews, she would describe it as the night she learned that her greatest strength wasn't her ability to hit every note perfectly, but her willingness to let people hear her heartbreaking. People think that session was about me failing 74 times, she would later say. But it was about me succeeding 74 times at the wrong thing. Technical perfection is easy for me. Vulnerability is hard. And David Foster pushed me until I had no choice but to be vulnerable. Because I was too exhausted to maintain my defenses. David Foster would include the story of that session in masterclasses he taught to aspiring producers. The worst thing you can do as a producer is accept perfect performances that have no soul, he would explain. Sometimes you have to break an artist down completely before they can access the truth. It's cruel, it's exhausting, and it's necessary. The recording engineers who were present that night, Tommy Vicari and Michael, would both go on to successful careers in the music industry. They would work on countless hit records with countless major artists. But they both said the same thing when asked about their career highlights. Nothing ever came close to witnessing take 75 of I Will Always Love You. Asterisk. But the story of that session has a shadow side that's often overlooked in the celebration of its artistic triumph. Whitney Houston gave everything she had in Studio B that night, and in many ways she never got it all back. The session established a dangerous precedent in her career and in her own mind about what great art required. If transcendence came from breaking down completely, if magic happened when you pushed past exhaustion into collapse, then maybe that's what excellence always demanded. Maybe that's what being Whitney Houston meant. In the years that followed, as her personal struggles intensified and her voice began to show wear from the constant touring and recording, Whitney would sometimes reference that night at Capitol Studios as both her greatest triumph and her greatest curse. David taught me that my imperfections could be beautiful, she told a close friend in 1998. But what happens when the imperfections aren't choices anymore? What happens when your voice actually is failing, not just pretending to fail for artistic effect? The vocal damage Whitney sustained during that marathon session wasn't immediately apparent. Her voice recovered within a few days, and she went on to deliver countless brilliant performances. But vocal coaches who worked with her in later years would note that something had changed after 1992. There was a slight roughness in her upper register that hadn't been there before. A widening of her vibrato that made control more difficult. Whether these changes were caused by that specific session or by the cumulative toll of years of intensive singing is impossible to determine. What is clear is that Whitney learned a lesson that night about the relationship between suffering and art, and that lesson would haunt her for the rest of her career. David Foster has spoken about the session with mixed emotions in the years since Whitney's death. He maintains that pushing her to that breaking point was necessary to capture something transcendent, and the result speaks for itself. But he also acknowledges the cost. If I could go back, he said in a 2015 interview, I'm not sure I would do it the same way. Yes, we got an incredible performance. Yes, it became one of the greatest recordings in pop music history. But I also pushed Whitney to a place that was physically and emotionally damaging. And I think that night established a pattern in her mind that excellence required destruction. That's a heavy thing to live with. The musicians and engineers who were present that night have their own complicated feelings about what they witnessed. On one hand, they were part of creating something that touched millions of people and will outlive everyone involved. On the other hand, they watched a human being get broken down in pursuit of that creation. And they did nothing to stop it because the result was so beautiful. 25 years after that marathon session at Capitol Studios, I Will Always Love You remains the definitive example of how vulnerability can transform a good performance into a transcendent one. Vocal coaches use it to teach students about the difference between technical perfection and emotional authenticity. Producers reference it when explaining to artists why sometimes the imperfect take is actually the perfect one. And fans around the world continue to connect with Whitney's performance in ways that transcend musical appreciation and become something more personal, more spiritual. Because what Whitney Houston did at 3:47 a.m. on that November night in 1992 wasn't just sing a song. She opened a vein and bled truth into a microphone, and that truth became preserved on tape for anyone who needed to hear it. She showed that real artistry isn't about hiding your flaws but about transforming them into something beautiful. She proved that sometimes you have to break completely before you can create something unbreakable. The take that almost destroyed Whitney Houston became the take that made her immortal. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Not because her voice was at its technical peak, but because her heart was completely exposed. Not because she had everything under control, but because she finally surrendered control and let the song use her voice instead of the other way around. In the decades since, thousands of artists have attempted to cover I Will Always Love You. Some have brought technical skills that match or even exceed Whitney's abilities. Some have sung it with perfect pitch, perfect vibrato, perfect breath control. But none of them have ever captured what Whitney captured during Take 75. Because you can't recreate vulnerability. You can't manufacture the sound of someone's heart breaking. You can't fake the moment when artifice falls away and all that's left is human truth. David Foster kept a photograph from that session in his office until he retired. It shows Whitney slumped against the wall of the vocal booth after Take 73, just before everything changed. He would look at it whenever he felt tempted to accept a technically perfect but emotionally empty performance from an artist. And he would remember that sometimes the greatest thing a producer can do is push someone past their breaking point, because that's where transcendence lives. But he would also remember the cost of that transcendence, and he would wonder if art should demand quite so much suffering. Whitney Houston's voice on Take 75 of I Will Always Love You answers that question in a way that words never could. It says that yes, sometimes art demands everything. It requires you to give until you have nothing left, to strip away every defense until you're completely naked, to break down so completely that the only thing left is truth. And if you survive that breaking, if you let people witness it and preserve it and share it with the world, then maybe, just maybe, you create something that will outlive you. Something that will touch people you'll never meet, in ways you'll never know. For reasons you can't predict, that's what Whitney Houston created in studio. Be at Capitol Studios during 75 takes that spanned 10 hours and ended at dawn. She created a piece of recorded music that's also a piece of human soul. She showed us what it sounds like when someone stops performing and starts confessing. She proved that the moments when we feel most broken are often the moments when we're most beautiful. And she left behind a recording that will continue to shatter hearts and heal them simultaneously for as long as people need to hear what it sounds like when someone loves completely, loses everything, and survives to sing about it with a voice that's broken but still beautiful. Still powerful. Still, somehow, despite everything, still able to make us feel.